It was one of those nights where the world felt almost unnaturally still. The highway connecting the quiet suburbs to the bustling heart of New York City was practically deserted, with only the occasional hum of distant engines breaking the silence. Inside a sleek, black limousine, Donald Trump sat back, the weight of a long and exhausting day evident in his contemplative expression. He gazed out at the passing streetlights, their faint glow dancing across the window panes and casting fleeting reflections on his face. The atmosphere in the car was tranquil, yet it carried an undercurrent of fatigue, the kind that only came after hours of meetings and decisions. As the car cruised steadily down the road, Trump's sharp, ever-observant eyes caught something unusual in the distance. A flickering light, a hazard signal, broke the monotony of the dark roadside. He leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on the scene unfolding ahead. The source of the flashing became clear. An old, battered sedan sat motionless on the shoulder, its silver paint long faded and marred by years of wear and tear. The car looked as though it had seen better days. And now, under the dim light of the stars, it appeared abandoned, except it wasn't. Nearby stood a man, middle-aged, wrapped in a worn jacket that did little to shield him from the cold night air. His arms were folded tightly against his chest, and his face was etched with a blend of worry and frustration. He paced a few steps back and forth, his eyes scanning the empty stretch of highway as if willing another car to appear. Someone, anyone, to stop and help. The limousine drew closer, and Trump's expression shifted. His usual composed demeanor gave way to a look of focused concern. His brows furrowed slightly, and his lips pressed into a thin line. Without hesitation, he turned to his driver, his voice calm but commanding, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions without second-guessing. "Stop the car. Right now," he said firmly, pointing toward the stranded vehicle. "That man needs help. You never leave someone stranded, especially not on a night like this." The driver glanced at Trump through the rearview mirror, nodded, and carefully guided the limousine to a slow, gentle stop on the shoulder, a few yards behind the broken-down car. The soft hum of the engine quieted, leaving only the faint rustle of the wind as it moved through the night. The door to the limousine opened with a quiet click, and Donald Trump stepped out, the polished leather of his shoes tapping softly against the pavement. He adjusted the lapels of his impeccably tailored suit, his appearance sharp and commanding, yet his presence exuded a surprising warmth. As he strode toward the man, his steps steady and deliberate, there was no trace of hesitation. Here was a man known for his power, wealth, and influence, now walking toward a stranger on an empty highway, his expression one of genuine concern. The man by the car turned, startled by the sound of approaching footsteps. His eyes widened slightly, first in relief that someone had stopped, and then in disbelief as he recognized who was walking toward him. Before the man could speak, Trump extended his hand with a faint but reassuring smile and asked in a voice both firm and kind, "Evening, my friend. What's going on here? Let's see what we can do to get you back on the road." The man blinked, clearly caught off guard, and took a moment to process what was happening. Here was Donald Trump, standing in front of him, asking how he could help. His voice wavered slightly as he replied, My car, the tire blew out, and the spare's no good. I don't have any reception out here, and I've been stuck here for over an hour." The man, who introduced himself as Joe, paused, running a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away the weariness of the night. He added, almost apologetically, "I didn't think anyone was going to stop. Most people just drove by." Trump nodded thoughtfully, his eyes briefly scanning the battered car before meeting Joe's tired gaze. He could sense the frustration and exhaustion that had built up over the evening. "Well," Trump said matter-of-factly, You're lucky I'm not most people." With that, he reached into his suit pocket, pulling out his phone and immediately dialing a number. His tone shifted, becoming brisk and efficient as he spoke with someone on the other end. "I need roadside assistance on the highway. Right away. A man's stuck out here with a flat, and we're not leaving until his car is ready to go." As Trump handled the call, Joe stood nearby, still trying to wrap his head around the surreal nature of the moment. Here was one of the most recognizable men in the world, standing beside his beat-up car in the middle of nowhere, treating the situation as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When Trump finished the call, he turned back to Joe, his expression resolute. "Help's on the way. Shouldn't take more than 20 minutes. In the meantime, let's make sure you're okay." Joe nodded, managing a small, grateful smile. For the first time that night, he felt a glimmer of hope. Trump's presence, his confidence, and his willingness to step in without hesitation had already begun to turn a difficult evening into something else entirely. And as the two men stood there, sharing the quiet of the night, the faint glow of the limousine's headlights casting long shadows on the road, it was clear that this was more than just an encounter between a stranger in need and a passerby. It was a moment of humanity, unexpected and deeply meaningful, unfolding on a dark, lonely highway. Donald Trump's figure stood out under the dim, flickering glow of the streetlights, a striking contrast to the lonely stretch of highway. With steady, confident steps, he approached the man standing beside the old, battered car. The chill of the night didn't seem to faze him, and despite his tailored suit and polished shoes, there was nothing distant or unapproachable in his demeanor. The man, who was pacing nervously beside the vehicle, froze when he noticed Trump walking toward him. Trump stopped a few feet away, offered a faint smile, and extended his hand for a handshake. His voice was warm, steady, and carried a note of genuine concern. "Hey, buddy, what's going on here? Let me give you a hand." The man, whose name was Joe, stood there in stunned silence for a moment. He blinked a few times, almost as if he wasn't sure he was seeing things correctly. He looked at Trump, his crisp suit, polished demeanor, and commanding presence, and struggled to reconcile the image of the powerful figure he'd seen on TV with the man standing in front of him, offering to help. After a few seconds of hesitation, Joe finally found his voice, though it was unsteady. I'm a construction worker," he began, his words slow and deliberate, as though still trying to process the situation. "I just finished my shift and was heading home when my tire blew out. My spare's been shot for a while now, and to top it off, my phone doesn't have any signal out here." He gestured helplessly toward the car, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the evening seemed to bear down on him. "I've been standing here for over an hour," he added, his voice tinged with frustration and exhaustion, "but no one stopped to help." Trump nodded slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the car and then turning back to Joe. He noticed the man's jacket was thin and worn, not enough to keep out the biting chill of the night. Joe's hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or the stress of the situation. It was hard to tell. For a moment, Trump didn't say anything. He simply stood there, taking it all in: the broken-down car, the tired man, the quiet desperation in his eyes. Then, with a slight nod, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his phone. Without a word, he began dialing. Joe watched in silence, his brows furrowing in confusion. Trump's expression was calm, but focused as he spoke into the phone, his tone brisk and authoritative. "Yes, this is Donald Trump. I'm on the highway about 15 miles out from New York City. I've got a man here stranded with a flat tire and no spare. I need a roadside assistance team out here immediately. Replace the tire and check the vehicle to make sure it's safe to drive. And don't take too long. It's cold out here." As he hung up the phone, Trump's gaze shifted back to Joe, his expression softening. He placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder and said firmly, "The roadside assistance team will be here in 20 minutes. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay with you until we get this taken care of." Joe stared at Trump, his mouth opening slightly as if to say something, but no words came out. He simply couldn't believe what was happening. This was Donald Trump, the Donald Trump, standing in front of him, taking charge of his situation as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Finally, Joe managed to whisper, "Thank you. I don't even know what to say." Trump smiled, his grip on Joe's shoulder tightening briefly in a gesture of reassurance. "You don't need to say anything, my friend. We all need a little help sometimes. Tonight, it's your turn. I'll make sure everything's okay." The two men stood there in the stillness of the night, the faint hum of the limousine's idling engine the only sound breaking the silence. Joe felt a strange warmth begin to spread through him, cutting through the cold that had seeped into his bones. It wasn't just the relief of knowing help was on the way. It was the unexpected kindness of a stranger, a man who had every reason to keep driving but chose to stop instead. As they waited, Trump began to ask Joe questions, his tone light but genuinely interested. "So, how long have you been in construction? Must be tough work." Joe nodded, his voice gaining a bit of steadiness as he replied, "Yeah, it's not easy. Long hours. And it feels like you're never really ahead. I've got a wife and 2 kids at home, so I'm doing everything I can to make it work. Some days, though." He trailed off, his eyes lowering to the ground. Trump nodded knowingly, not pushing him to finish. Instead, he said, "I've had those days too. Days when you wonder if you'll ever get through it. But let me tell you something. If you keep pushing, keep working hard, you'll find a way. You've got more strength in you than you realize." Joe looked up at Trump, surprised by the sincerity in his words. He nodded slowly, a small smile creeping onto his face. For the first time that night, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The chilly air seemed a little less biting now, the dark night a little less daunting. Amid the stillness of the highway, something powerful and unexpected was happening. An act of kindness, simple yet profound, was turning an ordinary, difficult evening into a moment Joe would never forget. Under the dim and flickering glow of the streetlights, Trump stood shoulder to shoulder with Joe, the chill of the night hanging in the air around them. His hands rested lightly in the pockets of his perfectly tailored suit, but his posture and expression reflected more than casual interest. His sharp eyes studied Joe, not with judgment but with genuine concern. Breaking the silence, Trump leaned slightly toward Joe and asked, his tone both friendly and sincere, "So, what do you do for work? You look like it's been a tough day." Joe hesitated for a moment, as though unsure whether he should respond. His shoulders sagged slightly, weighed down by exhaustion and a long day of labor. Finally, he lowered his head, let out a deep sigh, and spoke with a voice heavy with weariness. "I'm a construction worker. I work long hours, from morning until night, trying to keep my head above water. You know, I've got a wife and 2 kids at home, and with prices going up but my wages staying the same." He paused, shaking his head, as though reluctant to admit the full extent of his struggle. "I have to work twice as hard, and even then, it feels like it's never enough." Joe's voice grew quieter, his words trailing off as he added almost to himself, "Some days, when I'm driving home, I wonder how much longer I can keep going like this." The words hung in the air like a confession, the weight of Joe's struggles laid bare under the pale streetlights. His eyes, filled with a quiet sense of helplessness, avoided Trump's gaze. Trump didn't say anything at first. He stood there, silently absorbing Joe's words, his face, typically stoic and composed, softened, and he nodded ever so slightly, as though to signal that he truly understood. He didn't interrupt or offer empty platitudes. He simply let Joe speak, creating a moment of shared humanity in the stillness of the night. After a moment of thought, Trump placed a firm but reassuring hand on Joe's shoulder. His voice, steady and filled with conviction, cut through the silence like a warm breeze on a cold night. You know, I've had days like that too. There were times when everything felt like it was falling apart. I was staring down bankruptcy, wondering if I'd ever recover, wondering if I had the strength to get through it. But I'll tell you something important I learned during those times. It's in the hardest moments that we discover just how strong we really are. Joe turned to Trump, his tired eyes meeting the other man's gaze. Trump's tone was calm but carried the weight of experience, his words resonating like a lifeline tossed to someone struggling to stay afloat. "And I see that strength in you," Trump continued, his hand still resting on Joe's shoulder. "You're working hard for your family, doing what needs to be done. That kind of strength isn't easy to find, and it's worth more than anything money can buy. Just remember one thing: never give up. No matter how hard it gets, you keep moving forward, because you're stronger than you think." For the first time that evening, Joe felt something shift inside him. The words didn't feel rehearsed or distant. They felt personal, heartfelt, and real. He nodded, swallowing hard as a faint spark of hope began to flicker within him. Trump, sensing the moment, gave Joe's shoulder a brief squeeze before walking back to the limousine. He opened the door, reached inside, and returned with a chilled bottle of water. Handing it to Joe, he smiled, this time with a playful glint in his eye, and said, "Here, keep yourself energized. My friend, even if your car's out of energy, you've still got to keep going. As long as you don't stop, nothing in this world can hold you back." Joe took the bottle, his lips curling into a small but genuine smile. He chuckled softly, the first sign of levity he'd shown all night, and nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I mean it. Thank you." Trump nodded back, his expression a mix of warmth and quiet determination. "You're going to be okay, Joe," he replied simply, his words carrying the weight of a promise. For a moment, the two men stood there in silence. The faint hum of the limousine's engine mixed with the distant rustle of leaves in the cool night air. Joe couldn't help but glance at Trump, seeing him in a way he never had before. Not as the powerful businessman or the larger-than-life figure he had seen on television, but as someone human, someone who genuinely cared. In that moment, Joe realized he had been given more than just practical help. Trump hadn't just called for assistance or offered comforting words. He had given Joe something far more valuable: hope. Hope that, even on the hardest days, there was still kindness in the world, still a reason to keep going. Amid the stillness of the cold night, Joe felt as if not just his broken car, but something deeper inside him, was being mended. That small flicker of hope, faint and fragile just moments ago, now glowed steadily, like a lantern in the darkness. When the roadside assistance team arrived, Donald Trump didn't stay in the background or simply let others handle the situation. He stepped forward with his usual commanding presence, shaking hands firmly with the lead technician. His eyes, sharp but approachable, carried the air of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. His voice, steady and authoritative yet kind, rang out clearly in the quiet night. "Inspect every detail on this car carefully. Replace both tires, not just the flat one. I want this vehicle in perfect condition before this man leaves here tonight. Make sure everything is safe for the road." The technicians exchanged quick glances, momentarily caught off guard by the confident man in the tailored suit who spoke with such precision and purpose. But there was no hesitation in their response. With a brisk nod, they got to work. their movements efficient and focused. Meanwhile, Joe stood a few steps back, his hands tucked nervously into the pockets of his worn jacket. His eyes, however, were fixed on Trump. There was something magnetic about the way this man carried himself, something unexpected in his demeanor. Joe had assumed that someone like Donald Trump, wealthy, powerful, and busy, would be far removed from the struggles of an ordinary person like him. Yet, here he was, standing just a few feet away, personally overseeing the repair of a stranger's car. As the roadside team worked, Trump walked over to Joe, his tone casual but genuine. "It's cold out here. Are you okay? You've been out here long enough tonight." Joe nodded, though the chill in the air had long since seeped into his bones. His voice, soft and uncertain, carried a hint of lingering disbelief. "I'm fine, Mr. Trump. I still can't believe you stopped. Most people wouldn't." Trump's expression softened as he replied, "Sometimes it's easy to forget what's important, but I've always believed in helping people when you can. Tonight, that person is you." The conversation paused as one of the technicians called Trump over, confirming that the work was done. The flat tire had been replaced, a second worn-out tire swapped for a brand new one, and a thorough check of the vehicle completed. Satisfied with their work, Trump thanked them with a firm handshake and then, without a word, reached for his wallet. Joe, who had been watching the scene unfold, stepped forward in protest. "Mr. Trump, wait, you don't have to do that. This is my responsibility," he said quickly, his voice almost pleading. "You've already helped me more than I could have ever asked for." Trump turned toward Joe, his hand pausing briefly in his wallet. His gaze was steady but filled with warmth, the kind of look that stopped Joe's protests in their tracks. Placing a firm hand on Joe's shoulder, Trump spoke in a calm yet resolute tone that carried the weight of both compassion and conviction. "Listen to me. You've worked hard all day to support your family. This isn't about money. It's about doing what's right. Sometimes, life throws things at us that we can't handle alone. And when that happens, we all need a little support. Tonight, I'm here to make sure you get that." Joe's breath hitched as he felt the sincerity in Trump's words. He looked down, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to contain the emotions that were welling up inside him. When he finally looked back up, his eyes glistened with unshed tears. His voice was barely more than a whisper as he said, "You've done so much for me tonight, more than I could have ever imagined. How can I repay you for this?" Trump smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way that felt both reassuring and paternal. He leaned slightly forward, meeting Joe's gaze with an expression of quiet strength. His voice was warm and steady as he replied, "You don't owe me anything, Joe, but if there comes a day when you see someone else in need, someone who needs a hand, don't hesitate. Do for them what I've done for you tonight. That's how we make the world a little better. One act of kindness at a time. We can't change everything, but small acts like this, they matter. They make a difference." The words seemed to hang in the air, carried by the stillness of the night. Joe nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. Nearby, even the roadside technicians, who had quietly watched the exchange, appeared moved by the sincerity of the moment. For a man known for his wealth and success, Trump wasn't acting out of obligation or for recognition. There was no camera, no crowd, just a simple interaction between two human beings, one offering help and the other receiving it. As Trump turned and walked back toward his limousine, Joe stood frozen in place, watching the man who had, in the span of an evening, shifted his entire perspective. For Joe, this wasn't just about fixing a car, it was about restoring something deeper. He murmured softly to himself, almost afraid to speak the words aloud. "He didn't just fix my car, he fixed something in me. He reminded me that kindness is still out there, And as the limousine's taillights faded into the darkness, Joe remained standing beside his now-repaired vehicle, the chill of the night no longer biting as harshly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Joe felt a spark of hope, a warmth that came not from the repaired tires or the promise of a ride home, but from the kindness of a stranger who had stopped, stayed, and shown him that even in life's toughest moments, compassion still prevailed. As the roadside assistance team finished their work and drove away, Joe turned back to Donald Trump, his eyes filled with gratitude. He wanted to say one more thank you, but before he could speak, Trump reached out, clasped Joe's hand firmly, and said with unwavering sincerity, "Drive safely, and remember, God is always watching over you and your family. Don't let anything stop you from moving forward." Trump smiled, patted Joe on the shoulder, and then climbed into the limousine. The engine hummed to life, and the car slowly rolled away into the darkness, its taillights gradually fading into the night. Joe stood motionless, watching until the limousine disappeared from sight. His heart swelled with a mix of astonishment, gratitude, and respect, emotions he never imagined he would feel for a stranger. Suddenly, one of the roadside technicians walked over, gave Joe a knowing smile, and gently tapped him on the shoulder. "Do you know who just helped you?" Joe frowned slightly and shook his head, still confused. He said his name was Donald. "Just a kind man, that's all." The technician chuckled, his eyes glimmering with excitement. "That's not just any Donald. That was Donald Trump, the former president of the United States." Joe froze in place, his eyes widening in shock. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had just heard. Slowly, he murmured, almost to himself, "Donald Trump. It was him? But he didn't have to do this. He has everything, fame, fortune, and yet he stopped to help me, someone who's no one at all." Joe sank down onto the hood of his now-repaired car, his thoughts heavy with reflection. Trump hadn't spoken much, nor had he drawn attention to himself, but every small action carried a profound message. Looking up at the starry night sky, Joe whispered softly, "He did something so few would do, not for recognition, but simply because he cared. I'll never forget this moment." In that moment, Joe realized not just who his benefactor was, but also the deep, transformative power of kindness. From the depths of his heart, he knew that even the smallest act of compassion could create an impact far greater than anyone could imagine. After that emotional night, Joe couldn't keep the story to himself. On Sunday morning, as he entered his church, he didn't hesitate to stand before the congregation and share his unforgettable experience. With his voice still trembling with emotion, Joe recounted every detail, from the moment the limousine stopped by the roadside to how Donald Trump listened, helped, and even paid for the car repairs without expecting anything in return. Joe looked around at the congregation, his eyes shining with deep gratitude. "I used to think that people like Mr. Trump, wealthy and powerful, would never care about ordinary folks like us. But he proved me wrong. He's not just a leader or a successful businessman. He's someone who knows how to love and share." Joe paused briefly, his voice lowering but filled with conviction. What he did is a perfect example of what God teaches us: love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't have to do it, but he did. And because of that, not only was my car fixed, but my faith in the goodness of people was restored. Joe's story quickly spread beyond the church, reaching friends, co-workers, and even strangers he had never met. It wasn't just a tale about Donald Trump's kindness. It became a lesson on how each of us can make a difference, no matter how small, in someone else's life. One member of the congregation quietly remarked, "If someone like Donald Trump, with all his power and fame, can stop to help a stranger, why can't we do the same?" His actions remind me that kindness, no matter how simple, has the power to change a life, one person at a time. From that day forward, Joe's story wasn't just a cherished memory, but a quiet call to action. Look around you, pause, and help when you can. A small act of kindness can become a great source of inspiration, spreading God's light and love throughout the world. This story not only highlights a deeply human and relatable side of Donald Trump, a man often known for his image of power and strength, but also conveys a profound lesson. No matter who you are or where you stand, you have the ability to make a difference. Trump's simple act of kindness, in what seemed like a small, fleeting moment, left a lasting impact on Joe and everyone who heard this story. It wasn't power, fame, or wealth that made the difference. It was compassion that illuminated the true meaning of life. Trump's actions serve as a powerful reminder. We are called by God to live with love, to share, and to bring His light to those around us. Sometimes, it only takes a small gesture, pausing to help someone in need, to change a life. Joe's story is not just about the goodness of one individual. It's an invitation for all of us to reflect. What can you do today to bring hope and light into someone else's life? In this fast-paced and often overwhelming world, taking a moment to stop, listen, and help another person doesn't just change their life. It enriches the meaning of our own. Let this story inspire you to spread love and kindness, because God's light shines brightly in every small, yet deeply meaningful act.